Welcome to week 5 of our summer 2020 online class on the quality of attention. Such a treat to see all of you here today, taking care of your practice on this Sunday. And our topic for this week is attention to emptiness. So I am going to mute you all and give a brief recap of the Dhamma talk for this week. And I just want to mention that I am aware of the fact that we are touching on some very large topics. We are touching on some very profound and subtle topics. So I appreciate that you're all still swimming in the stream of Dhamma, and hopefully you're not feeling like you're drowning. You can just kind of turn over and float for a while if you feel like it's too much to take in. And not to worry about parts that you don't understand at this point, and feel free to ask questions and to, discuss amongst yourselves or write into the forum. But also know that my personal experience has been that Dhamma can become clear suddenly at any time. 10 years later, I'm still having aha moments about things that my Zen master in Japan said to me. So it's not lost. Even if you can't remember it, it's not lost. In fact, Eihei Dogen, the founder of Soto Zen tradition, wrote that very specifically into one of his chapters of the Shobogenzo, his life's work. And I can't recall off the top of my head which chapter it is, but he said very clearly that that was his impression as well. So attention to emptiness. So just hopping back a little bit, last week, week 4, we were looking at kamma, or karma in Sanskrit, the principle of, you could say, moral unfolding, or the principle of the unfolding or of the results of our actions of body, speech, and mind in various ways. And related to that, we looked at this phrase that the Buddha often used, at least according to the Pali texts and the Chinese agamas, this phrase, yoniso manasikara, that's the Pali for it, meaning wise attention, or sometimes understood to be a kind of careful attention, and related to the word for womb, yoni, so a kind of attention perhaps to the source or the origin or the space of holding all things. And so one of the principles that we apply our wise attention to is the principle of kamma. And another one that we're applying our attention to in the class is emptiness. So emptiness is one of the major teachings of Buddhism. It runs throughout both early Buddhism and later Buddhism, although it's spoken about in very different ways. And so you saw there was that article by Andrew Olendzki about a little bit about how the term has been used in slightly different ways here and there in different traditions. But making the distinction between impermanence and emptiness. So impermanence is talking about change. Emptiness is talking about the reason for change or the direction of change, because it's pointing at conditionality. It's pointing at the fact that all things are only momentarily present, only fleetingly present, based on the causes and conditions that are necessary for them to be here. And so related to that, we looked at the shorter discourse on emptiness by the Buddha, the Chula Sunyata Sutta, from the middle length discourses, the Majjhima Nikaya, in which the Buddha talks about emptiness in a very mundane kind of way, like there are no cows and elephants in your house. and therefore your house is empty of cows and elephants. And in the same way, a person is empty of self, empty of an independently arising, permanent, essential existence. And then we looked at the way that the Mahayana talks about it in terms of the breadth of that brilliant teaching actually applying to all things, not just a human mind and body, but literally all things are conditional. They are only present for the time for which their causes and conditions are present. And so the Heart Sutra and is famous for this teaching on emptiness, right? Saying form. So our bodies are an example of form, but also the building and the earth that I'm sitting on and the lamp and the cat, all of those things are examples of form. Form is emptiness. Form has the attribute of emptiness. So it has the attribute of being conditional. And the other half of that sentence is emptiness is form, meaning what? That conditionality expresses itself as form, expresses itself as all the other khandhas as well: perception, feeling tone, consciousness, volitional thoughts. All of those things are expressions of conditionality. And for that reason, then, at the end of the shorter discourse on emptiness, the Buddha specifically says, and a practitioner who has attained even some of the most sublime meditations observes that clearly, saying those things are predicated on volition and conditions. And knowing that, then they are freed from them. They understand that everything, the whole of human life, is just a bundle of conditions within a universe of conditions. And so similarly echoed in the Diamond Sutra, which is also part of the same body of text, the Wisdom Beyond Wisdom text, or the Prajnaparamita, as they're said in Sanskrit, Prajnaparamita Sutras, actually. We have this beautiful phrase from chapter 28 of the Diamond Sutra: a practitioner who gains the patient acquiescence in things which fail to be produced has seen wisdom, is experiencing the wisdom beyond wisdom, or the highest form of wisdom. And then I read a little bit from the Nagarjuna, also very, very influential early Buddhist teacher, philosopher, practitioner, awakened being. And then I used the match analogy. Some of you probably remember that. In one place, I can strike the match and fire appears. And in another place, I'd pull a match out of the same box and strike the match and fire doesn't appear. So why? Because it's empty. It's based on its causes and conditions. And somehow in that second case, though I can't discern the difference, there is not the proper set of causes and conditions for fire. Very, very simple way of looking at it. So why do we study this? We study this because it helps us see that there is not an essential permanent self, that our idea of who we are, our identity and our body and our mind and everything that we think is ourself is also like this. And therefore we don't suffer when it changes. We don't suffer when it changes, because that's the nature of the thing. And that also relates to death, our relationship to death, because death is also part of that expression, that the causes and conditions for this human being eventually begin to withdraw, sometimes rapidly, very unexpectedly. And I talked a little bit about that sense of an untimely death, which is really more about whether we saw it coming or not, than it truly being untimely, right? It must have been timely in the sense of the conditions being present for death. And then we had that very, very, what I find fascinating, increasingly more fascinating every time I read it, story about the appointment in Samara, the appointment with the Grim Reaper, which to me was a very interesting demonstration of the fact that we don't know what the causes and conditions of our death are, and we cannot run away from that eventual set of conditions happening. So we better learn to find our peace with it, or I hope that we learn to find our peace with it. And similarly, Patachara, or Patachara, as is properly pronounced in the early Buddhist texts, Venerable Bhikkhuni Patachara, one of the awakened women of the Buddha's time, did exactly that, right? Was dealt an incredibly difficult set of cards, lost her entire family over a very short period of time, was completely overcome with the grief of that, and had, thankfully, thanks to someone who actually pointed her in the direction of the Buddha, she came to find out for herself that she could really learn how to be present for that experience and allow it to teach her what she needed to know in order to be free, in order to be not overcome by it. And in that time, the Buddha is said to have said to her, "I cannot help you." A kind of shocking statement. Sometimes I think, wow, it's to my knowledge, it's the only place in the entire set of texts ever that I've ever encountered in any form of Buddhism where the Buddha says, "I cannot help you, but you can help yourself. I will show you how you can help yourself." So that is the wrap up for today. And as promised, we will do some dyads, but I think I'd rather start with some Q&A, and then we'll get into the group exercise in a little while. So as usual, if you have a comment or a question or a confusion or a concern or a beautiful insight or an experience, a relevant experience, any of those things, all of those things, please feel free to raise your hand, and I'll call on you one at a time and we can explore that. Dana, please unmute yourself. There you go.
Although I've read it before, I really appreciated the example about paper, because it's so simple about, that paper's a moment in the life of a tree, in the air, in all of that, and got me thinking about the other examples in writings about how you can contribute to the causality, how you can bring the precepts into it. And so often we think things happen and it's just like, oh, that happened, but you can slow it down, you can think about it. And that was from your Heart Sutra talk, one of the required readings, and I just appreciated it. That's all.
Okay, great. Yes, so learning to see all, even the simplest things in our lives as really connected to so many other things, connected in a sense to everything else if you look at it in that kind of chain of events way. Yeah. And what we bring to it, I also heard a bit of that, Dana, what we bring to it, right? That there is some skill that can be brought to bear. It's not just that we are random beings being randomly subjected to causes and conditions either. Otherwise, the Buddha said, if I didn't know that you could do this, I wouldn't teach it to you. If I didn't know that it was possible for you, I wouldn't teach it to you. Yes, Jack, please unmute yourself.
So I hope this is not just a semantic question, and the copy of the sutta I'm referring to is in the other room, so I'm going on my notes. But I think there is repetition of the language, something like oneness dependent upon perception of, and then it varies from verse to verse. Is that so? My question is, in my, I guess, training or experience or just thinking or teaching, I don't see oneness as something that can be dependent upon anything, because I see oneness as you describe it, wisdom beyond wisdom, or the ultimate awakening. So perhaps you can help me understand how the language is used.
Very good question. Yes. So this is a very important point because it is at the crux, perhaps, of the way that we are using language to point at different, based on how different traditions are using language, to point at different parts of the experience. So when the Buddha says the way I understand it is when the Buddha says oneness based on the perception of wilderness, for example, what he is saying is to see our integration within wilderness, to see that we are existing, integrated, completely interactive with this being is, so I could say, I would see oneness based on the forest, the Sierra foothills, right? Because I am perceiving myself as completely interactive with, integrated into Sierra foothills. So it's a sense of non-separation with that particular object. And what he does in the sutta is he goes from very complex objects like that, like wilderness, right, to things that are more and more and more and more subtle, right? Then he goes into different mind states, right? Ones that are more, sort of coarse or easy to access, ones that are increasingly more subtle, where there's less and less perception, right? Less and less sense of an object at all. So that's what he's doing, is he's saying, step by step, you discern your oneness, and when we talked about this in the first class, we talked about it as penetration with each object, right? Just by virtue of being in the presence of something, you're already having some kind of influence on each other. As distinct from, right, a more Mahayana way, and particularly I would say Zen also does this form of language of saying the oneness of all things, right? And I mentioned this, you'll see in the talk for next week, which is already done and soon to be posted. We see this not as implying, I think it's a mistake, is a very common mistake actually, as implying a kind of solidity, like it's one thing. Rather, when the Mahayana says the oneness of all things, it means that. It means like the skull bone is connected to the neck bone, and the neck bone is connected to the shoulder bone, and the shoulder bone is connected to the arm bone, and the arm bone is connected to the elbow, and like that. So there is a oneness in that kind of continuity. You see what I'm saying? So that is a way of looking at all objects, if you will, and seeing the interconnectedness of them, versus the Buddha saying, you just look at one object at a time and see your interconnectedness with that one object.
See, that's very helpful. Thank you.
Okay, great. You're welcome. Yes, Marianne. Let's see if I can, oh, there you go.
I have found it helpful in terms of understanding impermanence to think of things as verbs instead of nouns. And so I'm wondering if you could say more about the relationship between impermanence and emptiness, sort of in that context of emptying.
Okay, so impermanence is the broader statement of just change as a fact, right? All things are changing. It's not really giving us a sense of any order to that. Emptiness, or the emptying, so the emptying, you could say, is actually, as with impermanence, so pervasive and so fleeting, so fast, that oftentimes we're not really able to grasp it so well. So even if you think about your body, for example, as a conditional thing, right? The number of chemical interactions that are happening in an instant in your body is phenomenal, right? And if those things, when those things go out of balance suddenly, there aren't the right nutriments for them or the right state in the external world, right? Then that unlocks that and it stops working in that way. So the emptying, if you will, is just that. It's one cause, one condition goes away, and then boom, that thing. And it may not be readily discernible in the same way that we look at a mountain, and a mountain looks to us like a permanent thing. From the standpoint of the lifetime of a human being, for the most part, it looks like a permanent thing. And then at some point, scientists started being able to read the movements of the plates of the planet, right? And we have this thing called plate tectonics, and we know that mountains are actually moving an inch or two a year, right? And they're actually falling apart a little bit at a time, right? So we know some mountains are older by the fact that they're not as pointy as the other ones, right? So these are the ways, kind of very seemingly subtle, to me anyway, ways in which we're seeing the emptying all the time, but we have to really be willing to get down into the detail of it. It sometimes will come up and hit us in the face, right? Like when someone dies suddenly, that's like, right? There was a set of causes and conditions that were pulled out very quickly. But most of the time, it's more subtle than that. Is that helping?
Yes, and so if you were to use the word process in terms of emptying and impermanence. Does that make sense? How would you?
Sure. I mean, emptiness is the process of the conditions. You could say emptiness or the emptying, and it's also happening with the rising. So I was using various examples of elimination, but there's also emptiness that's creating the rising of things, right? People being born and plants, flowering and all these other things happening, buildings being built and so on. So you could say that the emptying process, or the process of emptiness actually taking place is exactly that. So the way that Dogen talked about it very interestingly is in each instant, if we looked at an instant as a slice of time, we see that all the conditions and the causes all fit together. There are no gaps, so to speak, right? All the conditions fit together exactly harmoniously for the state of the universe as it is in that instant. And then in the next instant, we take another slice, and some of those causes and conditions will be the same, and some of them will be different, and yet they always fit completely together. So that's what Miaoxin is pointing at. Venerable Miaoxin, the woman who gives the teaching about the flag not moving and the mind not moving. So that was one of the optional readings. And that's looking at it from the standpoint of a slice of time. So all the conditions are interlocking, boom, at this slice of time, and then boom, the next slice of time. And in between, there's all this change happening, right? So it just depends on how we're looking at it. We can look at it as process, or we can look at it as it all fits. It's all, this is the one, the big one that I was talking to Jack about.
So then impermanence would be the description of the process?
Impermanence is just looking at the fact that that causes don't live forever. So causes and conditions, there is no cause or condition that lives forever. Even emptiness, even karma, you can, the way that it's described is it's a principle, but it's fluctuating from moment to moment, right? It's acting out in a way, just in the same way as I was saying about gravity. It's different from moment to moment based on what's going on. But it's there and it's doing its thing. So impermanence is pointing at that part, at that fluctuation part. Yeah, you're welcome. Margaret, please unmute yourself.
I get hung up with grammar too, so I have sympathy with Marianne on this. And I wonder if we don't have a problem with emptiness because we hear it as a noun and we think of it as a thing.
Mm-hmm.
Impermanence, we don't think of in terms of a thing. We think of it as a state of being or a process.
Yes.
And emptiness, perhaps we should think more as a state of being or a process also. That there's no fixed, unchanging anything.
Yes. Actually, one of the best ways that I have heard of relating to that word emptiness was as an adjective.
Mm.
Like water is wet and
Right.
life is emptiness.
Right.
Or empty. Right? Life is empty, just in the way that water is wet.
It's just that sounds so bleak.
It
Whereas
does.
if you say life is constantly changing,
Mhm.
then it's neutral. And emptiness is neutral.
Yes.
But emptiness in English is the absence of something. So I think the language itself, the choice of the translation in the language, and I don't speak the original languages, gets us hung up.
Sure. Yeah. Well, conditional. You could try conditional. I think that's the closest, really. It's
Or principle and
conditional.
function.
A human life is conditional. That's all. That's
Yes.
all it is. It's just
I-
conditionality, or it's just conditional, and that also can have a bleakness to it if we want the Dhamma to affirm who we are, right?
I think Stephen Batchelor uses the word contingent.
Contingent is good, yeah. Yeah. Right. Okay. Are you complete there, Margaret? And I could call
Sorry.
on Tom. No, that's okay. Tom, please unmute yourself. Okay.
Hi. I think I understood emptiness as an attribute of reality in the way that we're talking about it tonight. I think I've also, I guess mistakenly, I've come to think of it as a state of mind that if we're fortunate, we can experience during which mind is completely still, say, state of, and we can experience things as they are. In reality, as a state of mind during which we, as in our reading on things that we can, state of mind is not emptiness, that it's just another things as they are. In reality, condition that I think I mentioned, but I can experience that phenomenon reality. But I was, can you
So,
comment on that?
so your audio is breaking up a little bit, but let's see if I can repeat what you said. So you were saying that you can understand
Can you hear me
the
now?
process. I can hear you, but it's just it's wavering quite a bit, Tom. So you were saying you can experience emptiness as process of all things, but then you also had an idea of emptiness as a state of mind, which enabled the seeing of the true nature of things, right? And now you're questioning
Yes.
if that's actually part of the way that I'm presenting it. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Okay, great. So, in the conventional use of the word empty, which we'll actually run into next week in Master Changcha's poem, in the conventional use of the word of an empty mind, meaning a extremely quiet or blank mind, that's perhaps where that idea could come from, that if the mind is that still and quiet, you could see other things more clearly. And I would suggest that it's not quite it. And so a quiet mind will sometimes enable you to see the sort of ethereal nature of thought. It will enable you to see how flimsy thought is, right? If your mind gets very still. And it will actually, and usually that's a very concentrated state. Those very, very quiet states of mind are usually very concentrated or very composed. Where the mind is not distracted, it's actually turned in on itself and more composed or collected. Actually, that's my favorite way of translating that word samadhi, is a kind of composure of mind or a collectedness of mind rather than a concentration, which has sometimes a sense of like a very narrow, one-pointed. It used to be translated, some people would used to translate that word as one-pointed, and we've gotten away, thankfully. Most people have gotten away from that as a real translation for samadhi because it's not actually very accurate to the experience. But anyway, a mind that's very quiet can be very composed and and because of that composure, it has a lot of power. It has a lot of malleability. It can be pointed at a very subtle object, right? That's part of what the Buddha is talking about in this shorter discourse on emptiness, looking at extremely, extremely subtle objects of mind. And that requires a fairly quiet mind. But the nature of all things, or you could say the emptiness of all things, actually comes from vipassana. The discerning the nature of all things is an insight, is a vipassana, and that's not a stilling of mind. It's actually seeing the diversity of experience and understanding the mechanics of the diversity of experience. So there are two different things, and they're both super useful tools. And emptiness as a principle is pointing more toward the latter, more toward how is the diversity of our experience, the literal diversity in terms of just the number of things that we're interacting with, but also how they're changing and becoming new things all the time. How is that actually a manifestation of something, of truth? So the extremely quiet mind is turned away from that diversity, right? It doesn't have insight into that because it's turned away from that diversity toward a stillness.
So in the discourse, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. But
Am I
just
still
close,
breaking?
please.
Okay. When the Buddha says that he abides in emptiness,
Yes.
he's not talking about a state of mind,
I think
or
that,
is he talking about a state of mind?
well, in the sutta, he does say he abides in emptiness, and he also says that for folks who have practitioners who have these different ways of seeing, that for them emptiness arises, or empty. Let's see where the actual phrase is here. Genuine, undistorted, pure descent into voidness is how Bhikkhu Bodhi translates it, which is not really my favorite translation. Sujato would translate it much better. I would say Bhante Sujato, which is the version that I gave you the link to, and I don't want to pull that up right now. But just to say, when the Buddha says he abides in emptiness, that's what he's doing. He is sitting, knowing what's present and knowing what's absent. And that's what his discourse is saying. He's saying, see what's there and see what's not there. There's Megara's mother's house. There are not cows and elephants. There's wilderness, and there's also, an absence of people in wilderness. So for him, in fact, there's a really, really gorgeous discourse in which the Ananda recounts the miracles that happened at the Buddha's birth, many miracles that happened around the Buddha's birth. And he says, is all that stuff true? And the Buddha says, yeah, all that stuff is true, but you should also remember this other miracle, which is that the Tathagata knows the arising of a feeling and the disappearance of a feeling, the arising of a perception and the disappearance of a perception, the arising of a volitional thought and the disappearance of a volitional thought. So that's what he means when he says, I abide in emptiness. I see the causes and conditions that are present, and I'm also conscious of what's not there, meaning what's not there? The self. What's not there? Some kind of essence that is permanent throughout.
And that sounds like a state of mind?
Well, it sounds like a state of mind.
That the Buddha achieved? Or is that an insight?
No, it's definitely, I would say it's definitely an insight.
Okay.
Because it's changing, right? In each moment, he can look out in whatever direction he wants and say, oh, it's like this. It's like this. It's like this. right? Versus a state of mind would be, in my view, the way I use that term when I say, oh, I'm in this blank, XYZ state of mind. It is also changing from moment to moment, but it has a feeling like it's a flow. So, oh, I felt sad for the last 10 minutes, let's say. That in truth is a repetition, but the way we experience it is there's a period of time in which the mind is colored by sadness, let's say. Right? And so the Buddha isn't saying that his mind is colored by emptiness. He's saying, I can see that mechanism at work. I see that mechanism here. I see that mechanism here. I see that mechanism here. So hopefully that helps. Yep.
Yes.
Okay.
I was just going to say, and this is very helpful, differentiating an insight from a state of mind and considering an insight as an experience with which to go on to live life holding that experience and to play out the understandings and that brings to living life. And I guess, and so that would be developing wisdom, so to speak, as opposed to having the insight going, oh, that was interesting, and moving on, but really holding it and seeing what the ramifications are for living life.
Yes, seeing very clearly, seeing what the ramifications are. Exactly.
Yes.
Yeah. And so seeing that principle, whatever principle it is that one had an insight about, perhaps all of them.
Yes.
Yeah. Great. Hopefully also this we'll have some more of this conversation next week, Tom, if you're around for the conversation for the discussion.
I will be.
Great. Beautiful.
Thanks.
We'll do more of this. Yes, Shelley, please unmute yourself.
So the concept of thought waves has been on my mind all evening. I'm thinking of how all of us are creating you in our mind. We're getting thought waves from listening to you and seeing each other. Yeah. And I just kept having this thought wave go through my mind that if you were a Buddha, you could step out of all thought waves. And if you don't have thought waves, then you're not hampered by a mind anymore. And perhaps you could be in the void or emptiness, but be able to step back in and watch thought waves because you're still in a body. So I don't know if that makes sense to you, but I'm just thinking that to me, emptiness may be cessation of all thought waves, but not still have karma left in a body. You haven't disappeared yet. Do you know what I'm saying?
I know what you're saying, Shelley, and I wouldn't call that emptiness. I would call that like maybe a meditation on neither perception nor non-perception, or a meditation on the base of infinity, or the meditation on boundlessness. Like maybe after the Brahma Viharas, you can have an experience of total boundlessness without thought. Mm-hmm. Those kinds of experiences. So I wouldn't call that emptiness, and that's why I think also the translation of emptiness as void can be quite confusing. I think that actually makes me think of like that of that, like, you know, the more mundane way that the Buddha started talking about it, as like the box is empty of, you know, the present, whatever present came in it. That kind of voidness is, I think, meant to be more metaphorical than it is meant to be actually the principle of emptiness, because emptiness is more active than that, at least in my experience. I think that's more, right. Yeah, but those kinds of mind where there is that kind of absence are definitely possible. And I would say again, the kind of composure of the mind in that state is something that the Buddha said could be very helpful as a support to insight.
So even if there's an absence of all thought waves, I mean, if there's not even awareness of self, we're still not there. And
Yeah.
the shorter discourse on emptiness, I followed that, and I'm seeing that path and relating to that.
Right,
Yes.
because as it says at the end there, he says, even if the practitioner experiences the neither perception nor non-perception, right? So no perception of anything.
Yes.
They know, and presumably they know coming out of that, not in it, they know, oh, that was a conditioned volitional state. It doesn't last forever, and it wasn't just an accident. It is something based on my sitting here and applying my mind to the breath and to itself and so on, and understanding that. But let me also say this. As for stepping off altogether, the Buddha did advocate that. And he said that after he died, he stepped off altogether, and that people who, the folks who have a realization, a profound realization about karma, could live so in harmony with karma that they weren't creating a karma that would lead them into a next life, that they would step off of that wheel of development of consciousness and therefore thought and all the things that go along with that.
Right.
Yeah. Yep.
Well, thank you.
Okay. Is that what you were meaning to talk about? Or
Well,
I'm not sure.
until I'm a realized person, this is about as far as I can get for today. That's
Okay.
about it.
Okay. Okay, great. Olivia, I see your hand up, but I'm also seeing that it's 5:20, and so we only have about 25 minutes left, and I want us to do our dyad, and then we can come back. Okay? Excellent. So this is our dyad for today. If you're up for it, I'm going to try once again, more smoothly this time, to put you all in groups of 2. And what I would like you to do is, first of all, introduce yourself, make sure you know each other's names and where you are, what city or state or town or universe or state of mind, whatever, however you want to define that. You say a word or 2 about where you are. Okay. And then you'll have to time each other, you'll have about 5 minutes for each person to speak. So one person will listen and one person will just be the speaker. You can decide who's going first. And so the person who is the listener is going to be asking the question. And so the speaker starts first, and the speaker says, I perceive X. You can say, I hear blah, 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 or I see, or I feel in my body, or I'm thinking da, da, da. I perceive some phenomena, whatever it is. I'm not going to give you too many pointers because I want to see what comes up for you individually. I perceive X. And then the person who is the listener says the question, which is dependent on what? Kindly, dependent on what? So you said you saw a bird out the window, and the person says to you, dependent on what? And you might come up with one answer, or you might come up with a stream of 10 answers, or you might, whatever it is. And then when your answer is done, then that person who's listening will say, okay. And then they will ask you again, dependent on what? So all those things that you said in answer to the first time of the question, then what are those things dependent on? Okay, so you have 5 minutes to riff on dependent on what, and then hopefully you will switch places and give your partner an opportunity to do the same. All right, so one person starts, they name their perception, the questioner says dependent on what, and you just go back and forth. All right, beautiful. Okay, so if you don't want to be in your, and so I'm stopping recording now.